When you ask people to name their favorite horror fiction writer, most people will say somebody like Stephen King. He would be my choice as well. In this episode, we're going to look at a movie based on a story written in 1922 by one of the writers Stephen King cites as an inspiration, Mr. H.P. Lovecraft himself, in the 1985 movie Re-animator. We'll take a look back at this classic horror movie on the next Back to the Feature.
Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
The movie opens with a bizarre scene happening at a medical university in Switzerland, where a young med student named Herbert West is found kneeling over the body of his professor, Dr. Gerber. He's holding an empty syringe, and Dr. Gerber is screaming in pain and is quite blue in the face. The police pull Herbert away when Gerber jumps up holding his head, and suddenly his eyes begin to bulge out until they burst and he falls over dead. His vitals are checked and yep, he's dead all right. Herbert says of course he's dead. The dosage was too large. The school administrator says that Herbert killed him, but Herbert has no shame. He simply replies, "No, I did not. I gave him life." Herbert ends up at a medical school in Massachusetts to further his studies. He rents a room from a fellow student named Dan and is allowed to convert the basement into a laboratory. They make an unlikely pair as Herbert has a tendency to irritate the faculty with his cockiness, and Dan is dating Megan, who happens to be the dean's daughter. Her dad thinks they're just friends and study partners, but she promises that the minute Dan graduates with his MD, she'll marry him. Herbert and Dan sit in class as their instructor, Dr. Hill, demonstrates how to access the human brain in an autopsy. He explains that the brain can survive for a maximum of 6 to 12 minutes after death. This is a fact that Herbert doesn't agree with, and he displays his frustration by snapping a pencil in two to disrupt Dr. Hill. It's very clear that these two men do not like each other. The dean hosts a dinner to celebrate Dr. Hill winning an award, and it becomes apparent that old Dr. Hill might have a thing for Megan. Being a much older guy, he comes off pretty creepy. And before she can leave for her study date with Dan, she has to stand there as he delivers a toast to her and her beauty. And the whole thing is very awkward. Dan wants to fool around, but Megan's not in the mood. She's got some stuff on her mind and she lets Dan know. First, Herbert creeps her out. He never comes out of his room, and then Rufus, their cat, is scared of him. Dan brushes that off as standard cat stuff, but Megan doesn't think so. She then asks where's Rufus. He hasn't been seen or heard the whole time she's been there. They start searching for the missing kitty, and Megan looks in Herbert's room. He's not there, but Rufus is. And on the shelf below him is a bottle filled with a glowing green liquid. Herbert bursts in and is appalled that she would enter his private room. Dan comes in and Megan points his attention to the fridge. Herbert claims Rufus was dead when he found him. He gave Dan the old story about the cat knocking over the garbage can and getting his head stuck in a jar, causing it to suffocate to death. Sure, Herbert. That's what happened. Megan thinks that Herbert killed the cat, and now Dan wants to know about the bottle in the fridge with Rufus. Herbert refuses to tell them anything and threatens to tell the dean that Dan is sleeping with Megan if they don't get out of his business. So it's a stalemate. They agree to disagree. That night, Dan is awakened by loud animal noises, so he grabs his bat and goes to investigate. He follows the noise to the basement where he sees Herbert getting attacked by Rufus. The cat is not only very alive, but mad as hell. The cat attacks Dan too, but he throws it against the wall, killing it. And at this point, the cat is out of the bag. Herbert explains that he has developed a reagent that brings the dead back to life. He declares that he has broken the 6 to 12 minute brain death limit, and he enlists Dan to help him with his research. Dan is resistant to the idea because he doesn't believe Rufus was even dead the first time. He thinks Herbert drugged the cat and lowered his body temperature in the fridge to try and fake the results. Challenge accepted. Herbert confirms with Dan that he believes Rufus is officially dead now, and Dan agrees. So Herbert grabs a syringe and fills it with his reagent. He sticks the needle in the cat's brain, and seconds later the cat comes back to life. Reanimated. The cat is pissed but can't do much since its back is broken. And out of nowhere, Megan shows up and sees the dead alive cat and freaks out. The next day, Dan goes to the dean to tell him that Herbert has developed a way to bring the dead back to life. Of course, the dean doesn't believe him, and Dan counters with the fact that even Megan has seen proof because she walked in on the experiment. Not a good idea, Dan. The dean is pissed and tells Dan he could kiss his student loan goodbye. He's suspended, and he should let Herbert know he's no longer a student there. So that went well. Dan is rolling a fresh body down to the morgue, and the guard lets him in. However, the body on the gurney was actually Herbert. They're sneaking into the morgue to do a test on a person this time. But first they must search through the bodies to find the most intact one. And luckily they're able to find a John Doe who had dropped dead from heart failure. 15 cc's of reagent later, and they got more than they bargained for. We see the dean and Megan walking through the halls of the hospital, where Megan is trying to plead her case for Dan, even telling her dad that they were going to get married. The receptionist rats Dan out to the dean by letting him know that Dan's in the morgue. It's like a train wreck you can see getting ready to happen, but you can't do anything to stop it. After 15 seconds, still no reaction from the corpse, so Herbert shoots another 20 cc's into the stem of the brain. Still nothing. The dean is headed to the morgue after calling for security to meet him there. And Dan and Herbert hear the announcement for security to report to the morgue, and they know they're busted. They start packing up their things when suddenly Mr. Doe jumps up off the gurney. Dead Doe is now running amok in the morgue, throwing gurneys around. Remember the train wreck I mentioned? Well, here it comes. The dean enters the outer room of the morgue and hears the commotion inside as Dan and Herbert attempt to wrestle their new friend to the ground. The reanimated corpse knocks the door down, smashing the dean underneath. He picks him up and bites off a couple of his fingers and then tosses him across the room. Poor Dean didn't stand a chance. Herbert takes a bone saw to the corpse and pierces his chest with it, causing him to die. Again. Dan is just dumbfounded, but Herbert thinks it acted the way it did because he had been dead for too long, and now he wants to test it out on the dean. He's fresh meat, which is perfect for the next test. And Dan can't help but go along with the determined Herbert. While they get prepped, Megan sneaks down to the morgue looking for Dan. Herbert doses up the dean and they start watching the clock. And he sets a new record and reanimates at 17 seconds. And here comes Megan looking for her dad. She calls out to him from outside the morgue just as the dean gets both Herbert and Dan by the throat. Megan screams at the sight, and it's enough for the dean to release them in. The security guard returns to see the dean huddled in the corner, so he calls for help. And Dan is useless and just crawls up into a ball on the floor. Next, we see the reanimated dean is wearing a straitjacket in a rubber room next to Dr. Hill's office. Megan is watching him through a one-way mirror along with the creepy Dr. Hill. He wants her to sign a release so he can perform exploratory surgery on him to figure out what is wrong with him. He thinks the dean's problem is all in his head. And she agrees, but she doesn't want to know the details. She just wants the doctor to help her dad. And it's almost as if he's hypnotizing her to bend to his will. At least that is until she comes to her senses when her dad disrupts Dr. Hill by banging his head on the glass behind her. Without his influence, she declares she will take care of her dad herself and figure out what happened to him. Megan returns home to find Dan waiting for her, and naturally she blames him and Herbert for what happened to her dad. She slaps him across the face a couple times to make him talk, and Dan tells her that her dad is dead and she breaks down. Herbert is back down in his basement lab when he gets a surprise visit from Dr. Hill, who comes inquiring about what happened to the dean. He lets Herbert know that he knows the dean is actually dead. He wants Herbert's discovery so he can take credit himself for defeating death. And then he tries the mind control thing on Herbert, and I'm surprised it actually worked. Herbert hands over his notebook with all his research. And meanwhile, Dan and Megan break back into the hospital to see her dad. While Dr. Hill looks through a microscope, we find out Herbert wasn't under his influence after all. He picks up a shovel and whacks Dr. Hill on the head, and once he's on the ground, he uses the shovel to chop his head off. He then puts the head in a lab tray and decides to see if he can reanimate a body part. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for your contribution to science. He injects a dose into the head and then another dose into the body. The head comes to life first, and boy is Dr. Hill not happy. Herbert then asks him how he feels. While Dr. Head tries to answer him, Dr. Shoulders comes up behind him and slams Herbert's head into the table, knocking him out. Back at the hospital, Megan enters the rubber room to talk to her dad while Dan sifts through some of Dr. Hill's files and sees that he has a whole file on stuff about Megan. I told you he was a creeper. He hears Megan scream and runs in to check on her, and they realize that Dr. Hill has performed a lobotomy on the dean. Herbert comes to and finds that Dr. Hill has vanished and took all his work. Dan comes in and Herbert tells him what happened, and Dan is finally starting to get a handle on the situation and tells Herbert that he has to warn Megan because Dr. Hill has a weird fetish about her. For some reason, Herbert finds that funny. Dr. Head and Shoulders returns to his office and injects more of the reagent into his head. It seems the extra dosage gives him a bit of a boost. He has his body grab some blood bags and fills the lab tray with it. Soaking up some of the blood into his neck wound actually helps him speak better. He then instructs Zombie Dean to break out. Dr. Head puts a fake head on Dr. Shoulders and sneaks into the morgue past the security guard just before he leaves for his break. And once inside, he starts wheeling bodies out from the freezer. Dan rushes to Megan's house to make sure she's okay. She's all like, "I can't quit you, Dan," and then her dad literally breaks through the door and abducts her. There's a knock at the door of the morgue and Dr. Shoulders lets in Zombie Dean carrying an unconscious Megan. He lays her out on the table next to Dr. Head, and in a really weird scene, her dad rips off her nightgown, exposing her to the leering Dr. Head, who acts like a teenage boy seeing a girl's breast for the first time. Herbert finds Dan knocked out, and they rush off to the hospital where Megan is currently getting felt up by Dr. Shoulders while Dr. Head gets off on it. She wakes up and screams at the freak show she has found herself in. She kicks the fake head off Dr. Shoulders and screams again, which just makes Dr. Head cackle with glee. Poor Megan. She's completely helpless as Dr. Shoulders picks up Dr. Head so he can declare his love to her face. Just the way every woman wants to be wooed. He then licks her ear and then heads straight for second base. And then, being the greedy, gross bastard that he is, he ignores her screams and heads straight for third base. See what I did there? Before he can stick the landing, he's interrupted by Herbert, who distracts him long enough for Dan to sneak in to rescue Megan. At least that was their plan. Dr. Head and Shoulders had a plan too. Suddenly all the body bags in the room sit up and reanimated corpses come crawling out. Herbert, Dan, and Megan are surrounded and aren't quick enough or strong enough to put up much of a fight. Then he explains he has created a laser drill that allows him to do a lobotomy that gives him total control over the human will, thus his ability to control the cadavers. He has Herbert laid out on the table where they start up the laser drill. Zombie Dean approaches Dan and tosses him aside to get to Megan, and she pleads with her dad to recognize her, and surprisingly he does. Zombie Dean comes to what little senses he has left and saves Herbert by throwing Dr. Shoulders out the front door, causing him to land right at the security guard's feet. Zombie Dean starts headbutting Dr. Head, and then picks him up and starts squeezing. As he squeezes, Dr. Shoulders grabs him from behind, trying to make him stop. Herbert decides that this is the perfect time to test another theory of his. He grabs 2 full syringes and decides to inject a huge overdose into Dr. Shoulders. At this point, it's total mayhem in the morgue anyways, so why not take it a bit further? Dr. Shoulders freaks out and starts bouncing off the walls, while Zombie Dean finally squashes Dr. Head like a melon. He tosses the crushed head out the door, almost hitting the security guard, who's smart enough to not get involved in the crazy. And no longer being mind controlled, leaves the remaining cadavers to just lash out in anger at anything and everything in the room. They just start trashing the place. Herbert is watching Dr. Shoulders closely to see how the overdose does. He should have kept more distance though, as Dr. Hill's intestines come shooting out of his torso and wrap around Herbert's head and body. The ribcage of the torso then busts open and the intestines start dragging Herbert in while Dan is trying to get a hold of him. Zombie Dean protects Megan from the other cadavers only to incur their wrath himself. They literally rip him limb from limb. Herbert knows he's done for, so he tosses his bag containing his notes and remaining reagent to Dan as he and Megan run out. Herbert is then sucked into the torso and Dan and Megan are chased down the hall by a cadaver. They finally make it to the elevator, but not before another cadaver sneaks in and gets a hold of Megan's neck. Dan runs out to get an axe off the wall while Megan is getting choked out, and he hacks the hand off, but it's too late. Megan is down and out. He carries her to the ER where she receives some shock paddles and oxygen, but nothing works. She's gone and Dan has to stop CPR. Everyone leaves the room so he can be alone with her. He bends down to kiss her one last time, and when he rises up, you see the light bulb go on in his head. He grabs Herbert's bag and fills the syringe. He tells Megan he loves her one last time, and then injects the reagent into her neck. Fade to black. But then she screams. This was one of my favorite horror movies of the 80s. Some great casting with Jeffrey Combs as the weird but brilliant Dr. Herbert West, and of course the lovely Barbara Crampton, who would become a popular scream queen. These two would reunite a year later for the movie From Beyond, which was based on another H.P. Lovecraft story and directed again by Stuart Gordon. One of the good things about Re-Animator is the pacing. It moves along pretty smoothly without much in the way of filler. How many of you saw this in the theaters? If you've seen it recently, do you think it still holds up? Let me know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below to help grow this channel. I appreciate you taking time out of your day and hope you will come back for the next Back to the Future.